For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword is a proverb nearly everyone in the West has heard at least once. Its inevitable conclusion is reached every day in Afghanistan in the pursuit of revenge, one of the core tenets of Pashtunwali. Few embody this proverb quite like Abdul Razik Achekzai, once the most powerful man in southern Afghanistan. His quest for vengeance started when a newly formed group of reformers, the Taliban, hanged Razik's father from the barrel of a tank. His rise to power paralleled the pursuit of his foes, real or imagined, and his downfall was inevitable. Welcome to the boardwalk. Hey, welcome back to the boardwalk. If you guys haven't already, make sure to, I would say, like and subscribe, but I don't know if you can like on iTunes podcast, but you can definitely press that subscribe button or leave a review. It definitely helps us get this thing off the ground. Today's episode, as you might imagine from the intro, is about Abdul Razak. We've mentioned him a few times on. Actually, I think we've probably mentioned Razak every episode, haven't we? Because
Yes.
you can't really talk about Afghanistan post 2001 without Razak, particularly the South. Razzak was a Chekzai tribe member. And not much is known about his early life, but he was the son of maybe a Muj commander or some warlord, possibly in the South, at post-Soviet invasion. The story goes that Razzak's father was hanged from a barrel of a tank, from the barrel of a Soviet tank by the Taliban as they began their sweep through the country to kind of unify it under the Taliban government. So we talked about last week that Pashtunwali and the quest for revenge. So I mean, by law, by honor, Razak is basically bound to revenge against the Taliban. And so this podcast is about how he enacted that vengeance. It was quite brutal. If you guys want to talk about how brutal some of his methods were.
Oh, it's brutal and I mean, extremely controversial. When you look at some of these Afghan figures that we kind of talk about, if you go to Google, you're not going to see a whole lot on like the Gulag of Shirzais. You'll see some stuff about Abdul Rashid Dostum because he's now the marshal, which is I guess their equivalent of like the general of the army. So he's got his own laundry list of war crimes, and now he's in charge of the entire military. But the one person where there was a considerable amount of reporting on was Abdul Razik from Harper's, I think the Daily Beast, New York Times, New Yorker, The Atlantic wrote a piece on him, and none of them are very flattering. They all talk about how uh, aggressive he was. I'll use that word. How aggressive he was in trying to go after the Taliban. I think at one point he was referred to as the master of Spin Boldak. I think that's what the Atlantic called him, which is a reference to Spin Boldak, the city and the district, which is on the eastern edge of Kandahar, about center, like top to bottom, about the center of the province, and it's where one of the two major border crossings was in the country, and that's really where Razzak got his start. He fled to Pakistan prior to 2001, came back afterwards, and he joined the Afghan Border Police, is what he was a part of at that time, and he was a low level police officer. He was illiterate, couldn't read or write, and I don't know. Did we ever get confirmation that he knew how to read or write? I think there was
No,
speculation that we all figured by then he knew how to at least read, but not 100% sure.
it's unknown. We know that he hired a tutor. It's very likely he hired some tutor. As far as to teach him English, I don't know about Pashto, but certainly English. I know he could read and speak certain things in English for sure. So I think he did have an English tutor at least.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah. So
that's
he
certainly more than a lot of his contemporaries would, decide to do, and it kind of speaks to his sort of continuous relationship with the U.S., where essentially the trail for what he was doing for most of his adult life post 2001 picks up.
Yeah, and like Zach said, I mean, he started as a border police officer and worked his way up the ranks mainly through a system of patronage that's so prevalent in Afghanistan. He was a patron of Ahmed Wali Karzai, who is Hamid Karzai's very corrupt brother. We'll talk about that in another episode, most likely. Just all the sketchy connections that Ahmed Wali had. He was also a patron of Gulaga Shirzai, who we mentioned in another episode, who basically sold dirt, sold dirt to the United States at highly marked up rates, among other things, and would basically have us go kill his enemies and declare them Taliban. So Razik knew these people, and through his connections in the border police and just his, survival and just knowing them, seemed to get him promoted fairly quick. The last thing Hamid Karzai did before he left office in 2014 was to promote Razik to the Provincial Chief of Police for Kandahar, which is an interesting title because that doesn't really describe at all what Razik did. It's a very
Nope.
low title for how powerful Razik was.
And I think he was one of maybe 2 or 3 lieutenant generals in the Afghan national security and defense forces. Like of all the army and air force and police, there was like
Yes.
3 lieutenant generals, and he was one of them.
And I'd like to backtrack. The last thing Hamid Karzai did was promote him to lieutenant general. You're correct. Not promote him to PCOP. He was already the provincial chief of police, I believe, at that point.
Yeah, he'd been for a year or something like that.
Yeah, but he was a lieutenant. A lieutenant general was like no joke in Afghanistan. So he got this super high rank, and even that rank is not fitting to how powerful he was, because being a general implies that you have to answer to somebody. I don't know if I think everybody answered to Razik in southern Afghanistan to some degree.
When we dropped that Moab in 2017 was in Nangarhar is where we did that, and Hamid Karzai came out and said he kind of wagged a finger at America for doing that, and the next thing we seen was like a Tolo article that Razik flew up to Kabul to meet with Hamid Karzai, and like a week later, Hamid Karzai completely backtracked. That's how powerful this guy was. That he told Hamid Karzai is probably the only person who was more powerful than Razik, and he flew up there and told him to pretty much take it back, and he did.
And that's because Razik got. In the time Hamid Karzai left office, Razik's power absolutely skyrocketed. As a border policeman at the Chaman Gate there in eastern Afghanistan, basically he could control. The border police controlled the border crossing, obviously. So there's only a couple of actual ports, declared ports into Afghanistan. This is where all goods and services generally come through, unless of course you're smuggling weapons on the donkey trails up in the mountains. But generally you have to get stuff through these gates. So Razik was so instrumental in controlling those gates. So if you are the man in charge of controlling the port of entry into a country, think about how much corruption that you could engage in there. And that's where he made a lot of his money. And Razik, I don't think we ever figured out how much money Razik had, but he had to have been filthy rich. He had homes in at least 2 other countries. He had a place in Dubai, I think, and possibly Malaysia or Indonesia. I cannot remember.
I think it was Malaysia.
Was it? And he had a couple of wives in each of those locations, or one wife in each location, I think, is how he managed it. But he never went to those places.
I remember like when I found out that he had places in Dubai and Malaysia, and he had a wife in each one. And we're like, so is the wife in Spin Boldak the one he likes the least because she's in Spin Boldak?
Yeah, imagine the other wives that your husband is married to, and they get to go live like someplace that isn't Spin Boldak. Yeah, that would be awful. I imagine, unless you're. Yeah, it would just be terrible. That's a terrible place to live. I wouldn't want to live in.
They get to live in houses that aren't made out of ground.
It's mud brick.
I highly doubt Razak's Spin Boldak wife was living in a mud brick house.
Oh no,
she's probably fine.
No.
So yeah, Razik was a super powerful, super rich person from the border crossings, and then just smuggling goods, smuggling about everything you could possibly think of, extorting people. Remember, I think at least twice when I was there, he told people to stop accepting certain currencies at the market.
I remember that.
Remember that? What was the currency he said he wouldn't accept anymore? Was it the Pakistani ruble?
One time it was the Pakistani rupee, and both times it was after like a big attack or something like that. And Pakistan says they're not supporting the Taliban or Al Qaeda. That's a whole nother episode because That's absolutely not true. But I think like getting his pissed offness at Pakistan was like, okay, we're going to stop taking their fucking currency at the market for a couple days. That'll show them.
And he did. It was like a huge issue. At least twice, I think, while I was there, he stopped taking currency from certain nations. And it's important to note that the Afghani, the Afghani is the currency of Afghanistan, obviously. It was very weak currency, and so Razik was like, you know what, we're only taking the Afghani this week. So it just boosted the currency anytime Razik would ban other people's money. So it's just a strange effect of his power, I think.
Yeah, Razzak did not operate with Afghanis usually or Pakistanis. He was a U.S. dollars man. So, and he had millions of them.
A lot of the stories about Razik in general are I mean, they are anecdotes. So these are just stories you hear from people. One was that and I believe this one because his men were loyal to him to death. I mean, they were absolutely loyal. So how do you keep people that are generally undersupplied, underfed, and underpaid in Afghanistan? How do you keep them loyal? Well, you feed, supply, and pay them. So Razik was known to do that. If you were in Razik's, cohort or his army, you got paid. So that was huge. That's how he kept people so loyal to him across the entire country. So one of the stories was that he would carry with a briefcase full of U.S. dollars. And one time, and I think I can't remember, maybe one of our advisors or somebody was with him as he was out about his day, and one of his men had been killed. One of his police officers had been killed, so he shows up to the widow's house with a briefcase full of money and gives it to her, and it's like enough to live off of forever, just like he just gives this widow all like a ton of money, and that's how he kept people loyal to him.
Yes, and I think there's too many of those stories going around for it to not be true.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, if you were a soldier, you wanted to be in Razak's army because at least you'd be fed and supplied. And he absolutely hated. We talked about that road from Kandahar to Aruzgan and how those people were not supplied. Rahimullah Khan had really dropped the ball on that supply route. So Razak basically stepped in and started supplying those people just to try to pull that out. And those were not normally people under his immediate command. So
yeah, that would not fly in the American army.
no.
You don't do that. You have your own supply lines. You have your own chain of command that you have to operate through. You don't just get to go over to Nangarhar and go, hey, here's some ammunition. Saw you guys were running low. That doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and
Well, it just goes to show like how widespread and degrading really all of the corruption in the Afghan military is. When essentially he was he was definitely going above and beyond, but even like even if he wasn't trying to help other units, just the fact that he kept his guys consistently paid and getting like what they were actually owed instead of cutting from the top or claiming ghost soldiers or a lot of the things that he could have done, because he had these other money trains that he was able to pull in. He was able to keep his guys happy, and that in turn kept so much stability in his area, which I mean, Kandahar isn't an easy area to keep control of. I mean, it is where the Taliban sprouted from and where they have a lot of not just like religious but familial and tribal ties. So his ability to maintain such a strong power base there for so long, mostly by being tough and fair and paying his guys, is just remarkable.
I wonder how much more effective he would have been if he had been the Afghan National Army commander, and if he had Wafadar's personnel and resources on top of what he had already, just what he could have accomplished.
I think he had Wafadar's personnel and resources.
Well,
I think he was
that's a good point.
I think he was like the de facto ruler of the Afghan National Army in Kandahar, because when Wafadar was floundering around trying to retake stuff, I think in Helmand maybe, or even in Aruzgan. Remember those stories? It just shows how charismatic Razik was. He would show up and inspire the morale of the soldiers fighting, because they knew, oh, Razik's here. Like, oh dang, Razzak's in a tank today. Like Razzak's here, he's fighting. He doesn't wear a helmet. He's like completely fearless.
Like
So
Henry VIII.
yeah, I mean Razzak was no joke. I mean the guy was fearless. I mean at least. I mean you can say a lot about Razzak, and we will. We'll get to that in a moment. And we're definitely kind of hyping him up here and he was. I mean as a commander, yeah, fantastic. As a ally to the United States in the hunt against the Taliban, sure, why not? Fantastic. I mean, as a war criminal,
Fantastic.
as a war criminal, one of the best, one of the absolute best, yeah, for sure. But what's a war crime in Afghanistan? How do we define war crime in a place that's literally crawling with war crimes? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I will say one thing Dostum did have above Razik is that he was banned from Kabul for a number of years because his war crimes were so in the public.
Yeah, that's true.
Razzak had the decency to use like his secret prisons when he was, kidnapping random Kandahari villagers from the Norzai tribe and accusing them of being in the Taliban, and then taking a power drill to their kneecaps.
Yeah, or their skull or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Razik was a good guy. Was he an effective person? Yeah, I mean, absolutely effective.
That was the new standard of measuring corruption in Afghanistan. There was ineffective corruption and effective. I'm not even joking.
Right.
We started looking at these obviously very influential and at best shady figures in Afghanistan, and this came in line with Ashraf Ghani, the president, wanting to quote unquote crack down on corruption, which always turned into like mid-level bureaucrats in the middle of like Logman province who weren't doing anything anyways. Like, oh, you traded a watch for a free oil change on your Hilux, you're out of here. Stuff like that. But then you had the effective corruption people who we knew had, were involved in the opium trade, people who we knew were kidnapping people, who were strong arming locals to bend at their will at times, but they were effective. And Razik fell under that camp.
Yeah, he fell under acceptable and effective corruption, and I think with Razik's death, and we'll talk about Razik's death later. I think with Razik's death, it's kind of a loss of effective corruption. And if there was anything that held it together, maybe effective corruption was holding it somewhat together, and now it's just ineffective corruption. Which
hell, I mean, any viewers, feel free to set a Google alerts looking at Tolo News for news about Kandahar, because CAF is apparently closed. The Kandahar Airfield, where it was the second or third biggest U.S. base in the country, is apparently officially closed down now. So it's likely that we're going to see a lot of big gains from the Taliban in the area.
I didn't realize that it closed down. I didn't see that on the news. I figured that would have been more prominent, but
and a good indicator.
No one cares about Afghanistan.
True.
That's true. They didn't know that we were still there when we dropped a bomb into a cave and killed like 150 ISIS fighters. But a big sign of how effective you are in your corruption and strong arming is how often you're in the news, and that's what we brought up. That Razik was in the news a lot. His brother, who replaced him, I think his name's like Nadir Khan. Hadn't seen him in the news once, other than when it said he's the new chief of police in Kandahar. Right, so things are probably not going that great in Kandahar right now.
Yeah, I mean, Razik is the subject of many, and I'm talking fantastic journalism. Just that article in Harper's is actually by Anand Gopal. I noticed his name, actually. I checked the Harper's article. I know what you're talking about, where he talks about drilling holes in skulls.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Anand Gopal wrote that, who also wrote No Good Men Among the Living. So, I mean, you talk about a journalist, dude. Anand Gopal is up there with great journalists reporting on Afghanistan. But you have like articles in the Atlantic, Our Man in Kandahar. I think the Atlantic ran a couple of other articles on him. I don't know. Is journalism dead? Because the last good article I read about Razik I don't know. It's hard
like
to find anything.
2013,
Yeah.
2014.
Well, what's funny and what the Atlantic writers don't know is that, or what the Harper writer, I mean, and then Gopal probably knows, but like the Atlantic article, that's prime reading if you're new to the area. Like
Oh,
you,
absolutely.
you drop in as an analyst and you want to learn about uh you want to learn about southern Afghanistan. Well, you get, I guess Mike, the guy before me, had compiled a list of like all these good articles, and like I had added to it, and yeah, it's mandatory reading basically. So
My first week,
congratulations, the Atlantic. You've perpetuated the war machine. Thank
they're a part of the military-industrial complex. Didn't even know it.
you. Yeah.
No, when I got there, I read. Speaking of books, if you're out there, for the listeners, and you do want to read a little more, I read The Taliban by Ahmed Rashid, and he wrote this in 2000, right? I think it was 2000 or late 2000, and it talked about how the Taliban government was then, right before the lead up to 9/11. I had a week to read it because I was waiting on my accounts, and I read it in 2 days. It's a fascinating read and very much dives into that southern Afghanistan civil war that they were in, and gave me a really good idea of who the Taliban are and what they were about. One of the aspects of General Razak's war against the Taliban came down to the tribal level, as we explained earlier in this episode and previous episodes. Part of that southern culture in Afghanistan is you always seem to have warring factions amongst the tribes. And for General Razak and the Achekzai tribe, that tribe that they seemed to butt heads with most frequently was the Norzai. The Norzai were they were the neighboring tribe in Spin Boldak, weren't they? Like for the most part, there was that Norzai element down there as well as spread out throughout the province. But for the most part, the Norzai lived next to where the Achekzai were along the border, and they pretty much were rival smugglers. And
Correct.
ultimately,
Yes.
they sided with the Taliban, which only further fueled Razak's hatred of them because of his hatred of the Taliban.
Yeah. I mean, there were tribes that specialized in smuggling, both the Achekzai and the Norzai. So I hate to say like tribes that specialize in smuggling, but I mean it was the truth. I mean that's how they made a lot of money for the tribe. So um, obviously they hated each other. If you're a rival smuggling faction, you're not going to like the other one. So Razzak basically used that power that he gained through patronage to fight the Norzai, who the government assumes that Norzai are Taliban because they're so affiliated with the Taliban through history. So Razik is of course anti-Norzai. It's likely that Norzai Pashtuns hung his father from a tank, so he had it out for the Norzais to begin with.
And because of that, even non-Taliban Norzai were to an extent anti-American, right? So we talked about how it's not necessarily the Afghan government versus the Taliban, but it's warring tribes. It's 500 civil wars throughout the country. So that was an element of that. It wasn't always the Taliban conducting these attacks in places like Kandahar City. It could have been pissed off Norzai who know who Razak's guys are, who know which checkpoints they're at, and they're just going out for revenge, no different than Razak was with them. And so with that, you look at some of those articles, and you know, I think we've covered Razik hated the Norzai hated Razik and the Achekzai. But the one thing Razik had that the Norzai didn't have was he had the power of the government and, in his case, the military behind what it is he was trying to do. And you saw that play out a lot in these articles about his secret prisons throughout Kandahar City or throughout Kandahar Province, and his way of going around and trying to extract information, and I think very often over accused who was and wasn't, or who was a member of the Taliban to get information. And that just further created more enemies, not just for the Afghans, but for the Americans.
Yeah, I mean there's no doubt that Razik overreported Taliban enemies. And that was just like that's a common thread you see. I mean, you see it with Gulaga Shirzai. We mentioned him in another episode. You see it with John Muhammad Khan. We also mentioned him in another episode. They use their position of power to root out their own personal enemies, and they use the United States military to do so. So, um, I mean, obviously it's overreported. I mean, he hated the Norzai, so whether they were Taliban or not is irrelevant. But at the same time, even if they weren't Taliban, his constant persecution of this rival tribe forced anybody that wasn't the Taliban to want to join the Taliban anyway. So Razik is essentially creating his own problem.
Which is something that seemed to happen quite a bit. We spoke about that regarding Gulag Shirzai. He pretty much did the same thing, right? He used his connections and his power to take out his rivals, who in turn joined or aided the Taliban. And that's, we want to make every episode kind of tie back to why we are why we are where we are in this conflict. And that's a really big one from the perspective of the Afghans. When I'm almost done reading No Good Men Among the Living, and they're talking to that Taliban commander, Mullah Cable, and how he left the Taliban. He was done with that. He started his own business. He eventually learned how to fix cell phones after pretending to fix cell phones. And after the umpteenth time that the Afghan police show up and ransack his store and extort him for money, he went back to joining the Taliban. And you saw that, everywhere throughout the country, but you see it more so where you have big time power players. And Razzak, I don't think was technically a warlord, right? Because he was a government employee, but
he was a government official warlord.
Yeah, he was a warlord.
100%. Yeah, I mean, he was the best of them. Maybe one of the best warlords to ever live, and he used the power of the government to do whatever he wanted to do, which only aided him. And that is true in that book. You read about Mullah Cable. That's the sad truth of the matter, is that not only is Razik creating his own downfall in building enemies, but the United States, essentially, by allowing this stuff to happen, whether they knew it or not, is creating our own downfall in Afghanistan, because we created a whole Taliban resurgence without meaning to, essentially.
And the people there don't forget, like, this, the entire self-perpetuating like cycle of hatred in Afghanistan is fueled very often by personal tragedies that occurred. You see a ton of them when you look at, like, the civil war post Soviet occupation, or even during the Taliban rule, and then definitely post Taliban rule. A lot of lives were just completely flipped upside down, and when you're looking when you're looking at a lot of the key power brokers and a lot of the key players that the U.S. worked with or fought against over in Afghanistan, all of them have something in their past. Relatives being killed. Razzak, on top of that, was forced to go live in Pakistan for several years, and then came back specifically to fight the Taliban, and really never let it go. He kept that hatred burning for years and years, and in turn, some of the victims of his machinations and cruelty are likely to continue that on as well. And so we end up in a position where nobody nobody really comes out clean and happy on the other end of the conflict.
The first part of this episode, we kind of talked about how Razik was a very effective corruption, but I'd like to talk about, because we can't have this podcast and not discuss the truth. I mean, not only are there various accounts of Razik's cruelties, but I mean, some of them may be true, some of them may be exaggerated, but Razik was definitely an absolutely cruel human being to people he viewed as his enemies. So let's talk about that a little bit, about this really bad side to this effective commander. You can read a lot about it in Our Man in Kandahar, which is an article in the Atlantic, which I recommend anybody read. And just know that it is pretty much required reading for any political analyst. And you can read about it in the Harper's article by Anand Gopal. Just this horrible stuff that he would do using his lieutenants. So he would have these people that worked under him go out, round up his enemies, turn over their shops or do whatever, and harass them and bring them in and just either shoot them at best, or just horribly torture them. I mean, there's accounts in the Harper's article of a guy basically being, tied up crucifixion style to a police Humvee and like made to stand on a block of ice, for 30 minutes at a time. Like, I mean, it's just absolutely medieval in the stuff that these people would come up with. And these were Razak's strongmen, and that's who would carry out Razak's will in southern Afghanistan. So, whether they did anything or not, and even if they did, I mean, it's pretty much irrelevant. It's some absolutely horrible, horrible punishments or horrible tortures to these people. And you understand why we breed more Taliban or more insurgents doing such.
It was, and then at the same time, when you look through some of those articles, and then some of the reporting we saw, a big reason why there wasn't this big pushback from the locals was he kept us safe, right? Like if you weren't a Norzai, you were pretty much good to go. So you go to a place like Kandahar City, where there's really not a lot of Norzai up there. Yeah, the ones he's finding, we all assume are a part of the Taliban anyway. So yeah, he's going to go up there and he's going to mess up the Norzai's day. He'll kidnap a couple of the older teenagers, younger males. Two might come back alive. One will show up in a canal somewhere with bullet holes in his back. Nobody's going to really say anything outside of the Norzai tribe. Right? They're not going to care, because at the end of the day, Kandahar City was fairly safe. Fairly safe.
And at that point, the Norzai are marginalized in society anyway. So, I mean, who are they going to tell? The police? I mean, the police all operate under Razzak, Who are you going to tell? The Americans? The Americans are basically allied to Razzak. So, who are you going to tell? I mean, and people like Ashraf Ghani, I mean, he knew of this corruption. He tried to get rid of Razzak, but it's impossible because Razzak's more powerful than Ashraf Ghani.
No, easily.
Razzak is more powerful than the president of Afghanistan.
Oh, I don't think it's even close, especially in southern Afghanistan. If you want to say that Razzak can't go to Badakhshan and dictate what's going on, that's fine. But he ran Kandahar, and when Rahimullah Khan was in Uruzgan, he ran Uruzgan.
Well, John Muhammad for sure did.
Oh yeah. Well, and speaking of that, like Mahdiullah and Razzak, if I'm not mistaken, had a pretty good relationship, because they're kind of the same person. They would they'd clash every now and then, and they take a step back. But hell, they kept Route Bear pretty wide open.
I think what Zach was saying too, Stu, is that I mean when Rahimullah Khan was in Uruzgan, Razzak was in charge of Uruzgan because Rahimullah was so ineffective at whatever he did. So, I mean, you have this man who's this provincial chief of police for Kandahar, and he runs basically the entire police force, the border patrol. He runs the army basically because Wafadar's ineffective. He runs all of it, and he's so powerful despite what his title bestows upon him, and cruel. I mean, I've heard stories of him like shooting kids, like personally, like teenagers, and Razzak had connections to people that were in the Taliban. Razzak knew people in the Taliban that would work for him too. So the lines get crossed all the time. I mean, Razzak would call these people up. There's a story, I don't know if it's true, basically, and the Taliban were planning an assassination. Well, Razzak's man on the inside of the Taliban tell him, hey, they're sending an assassin to kill you, right? And it's like a 15 or 16-year-old kid. Well, Razzak knows that because his Taliban informant told him. So Razzak lets this kid in and shoots him with a pistol. Like, I mean, you hear these stories all the time.
Was that? I remember hearing that story like that. It was a suicide vest or something like that, and the guy that called him was the guy that was putting the suicide vest on the kid.
Yeah.
I mean, how messed up is that? Yeah, I mean, the guy puts his suicide vest on a kid, tells him to go blow up Razzak, and then calls Razzak and tells him the suicide bomber's coming, so he can maintain.
Like the story goes, Razzak told him make sure it doesn't detonate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying that like it isn't all one-sided. Like when the Norzai controlled Kandahar during Taliban rule, they were easily just as horrible to other tribal groups as
for sure, especially
now being to them.
Oh yeah,
especially those rival smuggling tribes, and like Kyle's saying, we're not trying to sit here and pigeonhole a tribe like that, but when your tribe is predominantly on a border at a very arid place that not a lot of shit grows, you got to find some way to make a living. That's how they made their living.
Yeah, usually smuggling weapons over from Pakistan, smuggling drugs. I mean, whatever. Yeah, I mean, you got to make a living somehow. I don't begrudge anybody making a living to feed their family, but at the same time, like, yeah, I mean, you have to understand these were rival tribes based on what they did. So, I mean, if you can use the Norzai when the Taliban were in power, yeah, they were absolutely just as horrible. But that's a very broad generalization too. That's not to say every Norzai was a
Oh yeah.
Talib, or that's not to
No.
say every Achekzai hates the Norzai. It's just a generalized.
Yeah,
If
Yeah,
tomorrow,
it's worth it's definitely worth understanding. Like I mean, we're just man crushing on this book at this point, but
yeah,
no good men among the living. I mean, I've been reading it, and even having been to Afghanistan pretty regularly over the past 10 years, it's still eye opening to see just all of the horrible acts that people were doing to each other, the past 40 years in this country. And it's just eye opening. There's definitely like not a single thing that one person could do to another person that hasn't been done there.
I'll start
Mr. Gopal.
reading.
Yeah, if you're
I'll
listening,
start reading
please
another
join
book
us.
next week, so that we can man crush on a different book. But no, what I was going to say is, if tomorrow the war ended, the Taliban, showed up with no weapons, extended an olive branch, and there was an agreement that there was going to be this one, government in harmony, the Norzai and the Achekzai would still be killing each other
That's a
because
very good point.
because that's how it would be. So Razzak took advantage of the situation, right? Climbed up through the ranks, got in real close with the president of the damn country, the governor of Kandahar Province, ran that checkpoint, turned that checkpoint into several legitimate businesses, and was making millions of dollars a month.
Right, and it's just absolutely amazing what that man, being illiterate, you know, illiterate, not educated, able to accomplish so much in that country. I mean, it truly is amazing what he pulled off.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's surprising to see how many of the key figures in the country were illiterate, and how Karzai kind of stands out among them because he could actually read and he was a scholarly type.
As sometimes happens, I misspoke a couple times during this episode. General Razak's brother's name is Tadin Khan, not Nadir Khan. Nadir Khan was the king of Afghanistan until 1933 and the father of Muhammad Zahir Shah, who was the last king before the communist uprising in 1973. Also, I started talking at the end of the episode about the security situation in Kandahar following Razak's death. I accidentally kept referring to the districts as provinces. There's a considerable difference between the two, so be sure to note that when I am talking about the Kandahar provinces, I really meant districts. Now, on to part 3. On October 18th, 2018, General Razzak was killed while leaving a meeting with American security officials in Kandahar City. Shortly thereafterward, his brother, Nadir Khan, was named the new chief of police for Kandahar province. And really, after that happened, we didn't hear about Kandahar province again. And some of that is speculation on our part that his brother was clearly not as effective as Razik was, and that with Razik's death, you saw kind of a shuffling in where people were working. And a great example of that is Razik's number 2 was Gorzang Afridi, who went everywhere that Razik went. And when they had this recent announcement that we were leaving Kandahar, it was released by Gorzang Afridi, who he was essentially the deputy chief of police, working as Razik's number 2. He's just a spokesman in Kandahar now. So when Razik left, a lot of that stability and security apparatus left with him when he died. And what makes that really tough is that Kandahar was already worsening when he was alive.
Yeah, Kandahar was not exactly. I mean, you could tell the security situation was deteriorating. I don't know what really caused that, to be honest with you. I don't know if it was the fact that the United States was pulling out and maybe United States influence in the region was lessened, and Razik depended so much on his alliance with the United States to enact his policies. I really don't know because Razik was never people still viewed Razzak as this strong man. They didn't change their opinion on Razzak. I do think that the United States' influence and power projection in the area was certainly lessened, which I think hurt his ability to enforce security.
I think when you look at why you saw that security situation deteriorate, and to kind of answer the question and kind of go back to something we'd mentioned earlier, the big thing in Afghanistan, right, was the provincial capitals, which was a stupid metric to measure success from a American military standpoint, but from an Afghan political standpoint was pretty spot on, right? And Razzak kept Kandahar city relatively safe. You'd still have a shooting here and there. There were maybe one or two, a handful of IED events in the year and a half that I was there. But when you look at where Afghanistan was losing ground, it was on the border, right? It was coming in from Helmand Province to the west, coming down from Uruzgan in the north, and then coming out from Pakistan in the east. So Razik, the best I could explain is he did what he could with what he had, but was eventually getting overpowered from where you had Taliban strongholds. And even though Kandahar has always been that historical and symbolic capital, Helmand Province is still the strongest of the Taliban strongholds, and he had to compete with that, and he had no answer for it.
During the period that we were there, we saw just the essentially cutting off outside support. I mean, certainly along Ring Road would probably be the most costly effect, which the Taliban were essentially trying to envelop Kandahar and then push in. That seemed to be their overall plan. And I mean, like as bad as things were in Kandahar, I always remember hearing how much worse Helmand was, and that started sort of seeping in as we were there, with districts in the north and west falling, and district capitals being moved, and sort of feeling that like almost inevitable push of Taliban getting closer and closer to the city. Which, I think we all had faith that Razzak wouldn't let the city fall, but you also his reputation mattered. Went pretty far for the position that we sent there, and so having the Taliban pushing in on him certainly didn't help that.
I think it's important to note too how Razik did eventually get killed, because Razik was basically Taliban assassination target number one the entire time we were there. So if they could pull off a kill on Razik, the Taliban would see a huge gain, I think. So the Taliban was always trying to kill Razik, and they had various ways to try to do that. But what's interesting is how they did it eventually was just infiltrate his guard, or maybe pay off a one of Razik's bodyguard, and just say, hey, kill Razik. Here's some money, and that's what did him in, eventually. And I think that was inevitable. I mean, we talked about that in the intro too. I think this this inevitable death of Razik, there was really no way it would have worked out any different. People had asked him, I think, why he doesn't just leave. Why doesn't he take his money and go to wherever one of his other wives are, in another country, and leave? And he was so bound at just so bound to carry out revenge and to fulfill his duty that I don't think that he would have ever stopped. So it goes back to the saying that you have to get lucky every single time, and they just have to get lucky once. So the Taliban tried to kill Razik so many times, and you're going to get lucky once. Basically, that's what they did.
Yeah, so many different ways. I mean, when like we said in a previous episode, when we were there with like the chair IED that injured a U.S. general, like all kinds of ways, and it only came down to some guy walking up and shooting him.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is a lot of times they tried to use some sort of an IED, be it a chair bomb, a car bomb, a suicide bomb, and then eventually they figured, what if we just try to shoot him? And that's what worked. But like when we look at Razik and his legacy, I think the security situation is pretty straightforward. So U.S. forces left Kandahar Airfield, or as you're going to hear us call it, CAF, 6 days ago. But we're recording this on the 19th of May. So they left on the 13th. And, that means there's basically no American presence in Kandahar. And I think it's very likely you're going to see after the September withdrawal, if it goes through, you're going to see a new effort by the Taliban to take Kandahar. Right? They're not going to. I don't think they're going to focus too much on Kabul and Herat and Mazar-e Sharif quite yet. They're going to secure what they have in the south and push forward to the north. And a lot of that's going to be because Razzak's not there. And I wonder if we'd even be leaving if Razzak were still alive.
That's a tough question, man. But I think you're right in that analysis, in that with a giant power vacuum in the South, with Razik dead, the United States leaving supposedly on September, and American forces leaving CAF, Kandahar is wide open. I mean, that's easy Taliban territory if they want to take it. Easy.
I give it not even a year. Right. And I think a large part of that, why I feel that way, beyond what happened out in western part of Kandahar and Rahimullah Khan just absolutely taking a giant dump on Uruzgan province, is Razak's failure. And this is, I think we should probably criticize some of his tactics as well. His indecision, or his decision not to do anything about losing Maruf. And when you look at Kandahar province, it kind of looks like if you took your hand and looked at the back of your hand and stuck your thumb out. Well, that thumb is Maruf, and there's no main transportation lines out there, but it's a big time smuggling route, and it's almost predominantly used by the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And Razzak, when Maruf fell, I was still an analyst out there, and we did nothing to try to take back the district, and it threw me off guard. And I wonder if part of that's Razzak didn't care. He was concerned about the border down in Spin Boldak. That's where he made his money. And I think he may have taken his eye off the ball. And so what ultimately happened when we lost Maruf, if you looked at Kandahar province and you look at these provinces that we've referenced that we lost, be it Gorak, Nesh, Kakrez, Mayaneshin, Shawali Kot, these are all in Kandahar province. And then you slide over to some of the Zabul provinces, and then Maruf, it created this belt. If you put all the provinces together and colored in the lines, it creates this belt that cuts off Kandahar city from the rest of the country. And Maruf was the final piece. And that's what they got before I left in 2017. And since then, it feels like it's just been a holding, they've been in a holding pattern. They're working on, the Taliban being they, are just working on shoring up that support they have out in the more rural areas. They're providing that judicial oversight. They're maybe employing people, usually by force, but somebody somewhere is getting money of some sort. They're just providing services that the government of Afghanistan can't, because they're not there to provide those services. So I think that's probably Razzak's big downfall from his time as the chief of police in Kandahar.
Yep. I think that's a pretty good summary. What's going on, and the rise and fall of Razik Achekzai. If you guys are interested in this, please subscribe to the podcast and at least download it, whether or not you listen to it or not. We're trying to get this out there. We talk a lot about these characters and figures from Afghanistan, and we'll try to create maybe some sort of social media presence. So if you guys have any questions about any of these figures or something, you could ask us on those.
Yeah,
on those lines.
We're not making this because people don't make money on podcasts unless you're Joe Rogan or a retired basketball player, but it's more so. This was an important part of all of our lives, right? It's the war in Afghanistan has taken up 20 of the 33 years that I've been alive. It's people need to know about what happened and what happens when you don't think things through, and that the sunk cost theory. This is the ultimate example of sunk cost theory. $2.2 trillion, a couple thousand Americans dead. a bunch of dead Afghans and nothing to show for it. So please like, subscribe, tell your friends about the podcast. People need to know about this type of stuff.
Yeah, we don't make money off of this. We don't have ads. We don't have anything. We want people to know.
Although
what's
if
going on.
Audible wanted to give us a code, I would say no.
Hey, listen, we are whores, so we will take all the money you can give us, but we don't have.
I'm not going to say no to a sponsorship or anything, but we're not actively expecting nor looking for any.
But yeah, we'd like to get these stories out there. So if you or anybody you know is interested in these types of stories, please send it to them. Thanks, guys.